So welcome also for the people that are watching this session later on. This is part of the Partners DEI learning trajectory that we have started this year. Today we're starting with the module on monitoring and measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as part of this module, we've invited two speakers to tell more about what it means to measure equity. How do you index it? And we've invited Arisha and Uma from two organizations that have similar names, but we'll explore it later, but a very specific focus on equity in international development. Are you here, Arisha and Uma?
Yes. Hi, Gigi.
Hi, welcome. So today we are going to have a conversation about what we actually mean with equity in international development. And these are two initiatives that have been accelerating and advocating for more equity in international development. And we would like to invite you to explain a little bit more about your motivation, but also what specific steps you could take as an organization if you want to raise your accountability and work on equity. So we're going to start with asking you to quickly pitch what the equity index is and what the racial equity index is. And after that, we'll have a couple of questions, but also open the floor to the different participants to share your perspectives. Yeah, so can I start with Arisha? I believe we have some slides that she prepared as well.
Yeah, would you be able to share your screen? Otherwise I can.
I think we have them here. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Some work in progress behind the scenes. In the meantime, you can already start introducing who you are as well.
Sure. Sounds good. Great, thanks so much. Great, hi everyone, can you hear me all right? Yeah, great. So I'm Arisha and I'm a policy and research associate with the advocacy team. So we are a political consultancy based in London. We support clients with their advocacy campaigns and research, and we center equity within all the work that we do. And as part of my work, I support on the equity index as well. So I was very much involved in the pilot phase of the equity index, sort of the public data mapping, for instance. And I've also continued to be involved in the work that's kind of been ongoing with the equity index as well. And the link there is the director of the advocacy team, Lorianne Robinson, is also the co-founder of the equity index as well. So our work kind of interlinks in that respect. So I'll just quickly kind of talk through our story and kind of what we do and sort of our mission, just as a brief overview. Thanks. So the idea for the equity index kind of emerged in 2019 when our co-founders Alex Martins and Lorianne Robinson sort of talked through the idea of a public index that would sort of encourage the Northern international development sector to sort of turn inwards and focus as much as on its own practices and behaviors and its work in the global South as well. And so the idea sort of slowly developed throughout 2019, and it was shared with a wide range of people from across the development sector, both Southern and Northern as well. And in March of 2020, a diverse group of international development experts also came together, and they sort of formed an official advisory council that helped advise on the work of the equity index. So the equity index officially became a community interest company in May 2020, and it was launched publicly in June 2020 after receiving our first grant from the Joffrey Charitable Trust. So kind of more broadly, the equity index is basically a UK social enterprise, and we advocate for greater equity across the international development sector. And we will measure and track multiple dimensions of equity in the internal and external workings of the UK development organizations to influence meaningful change in their policies, practices, and partnerships. So this includes racial and gender equity, equity in knowledge production, in funding, in collaboration, and more. And we believe measuring equity at the organizational level in an open and transparent way will raise awareness about the negative consequences of inequity, including the fact that development interventions are less likely to be effective and sustainable over the long term. So we basically aim to foster a race to the top rather than a race to sort of stay away from the bottom. So in the next slide, I'll just touch on our pilot for the equity index. So between July 2020 and June 2021, we embarked on a pilot project using this £20,000 grant from the Joffrey Charitable Joffrey Trust to conduct a pilot project with a focus on the UK development consultancy sector. And this ranged from small consultancies to larger corporate companies as well. And our overarching goal there was to demonstrate a new and impactful way of measuring equitable practice within and across development organizations. So this pilot provided an opportunity for the equity index to basically test a core part of our theory of change. And that was that creating and measuring a sample of organizations against internal and external equity indicators, when combined with advocacy efforts across the sector, will lead to organizational shifts and broader cultural change in the development sector. And I'll touch on those indicators a bit when the discussion gets to that point. So this work basically included background research. So we did a comparative mapping of existing indices and a briefing note outlining key definitions of equity that we found, which are all available on our website. And we also developed an indicator assessment framework, including an overview of resources for each indicator. We tested the indicators with pilot organizations. We did a mapping of public equity related data sources, and then we publicly launched the pilot results through a virtual event. And we also culminated all the learnings from that into a report that's also available on our website. And so our pilot basically focused on development consultancies, and it was based solely on publicly available data. But the core activity of the equity index moving forward, when we've secured the funding we need, it will sort of look at development and regular updating of an index that measures how equitable UK international development organizations are internally and in their work with the Global South. And we'll look at organizational policies, practices, and partnerships. And we'll look at different actors within the sector. So just beyond consultancies, we would look at bilateral government donors, foundations, INGOs and NGOs, and other civil society actors, private sector consultancies and corporate actors, and research institutions like think tanks and universities, just to name a few. So the goal is to look at all these different actors and assess them independently. If you move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the vast majority from then on now has been mostly pro bono. So since 2022, we've been focused on just fundraising and delivering on some exciting projects as well. So we have engaged in partnerships through a more consultancy approach. And these are with organizations in the global development sector based on the UK, either Global North or Global South, and organizations both in and outside of the UK as well in other sectors. So for instance, investment, corporate, education, engineering, and more. And these partnerships have been fascinating because we've had the opportunity to put the learning into practice. So for instance, in 2022, we partnered with development impact managers and advisors called DEMA, and we helped design materials on racial and gender equity in the Brazilian context. And this was put together as a guide on equity for Brazilian startups in Portuguese. So that was just one example of one of these partnerships. And aside from that, we've published resources such as a discussion paper on positive action. We've explored equity and UK equality law to explore the potential for the current positive action legal framework in the UK to promote greater equity in the global development sector. That's also available on our website. And we've supported the International Development Committee's inquiry on racism in the aid sector in the UK through oral evidence and written evidence as well. So that was just sort of a snapshot of who we are and kind of the work that we've done up until now. Thank you.
Gigi, we don't hear you.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. Can we invite Uma to present the Racial Equity Index?
Yes, I'm just going to share my screen on my end. So hi, everyone. My name is Uma. I am a senior consultant with the Better Org, but also the initiator and the facilitator of the Racial Equity Index. And my pronouns are she, her. This is just a brief overview, and it's going to be a lot of information in a very concentrated period of time in terms of our work at the Racial Equity Index and what we are doing. We are a group of BIPOC volunteers. We have up until this point received very minimal funding for our work, but we started as a collective of BIPOC development practitioners that are globally located in the global majority and also within the global north, because we have all experienced racism within global development. So I want you to hold that in mind as we're moving through what we're trying to do at the Racial Equity Index. We are a group of people who have been impacted by really harmful and inequitable practices within global development organizations. And so the creation of what we're doing within the Racial Equity Index stems very much and is rooted very much from our lived experience. So we're building an index, we're building specifically an index focused on racial equity to hold the global development sector fully accountable for dismantling. Our team is incredible, and our collective is amazing, and globally located. I should also add that we are completely peer reviewed, because again, anytime you do work rooted around discussions of racial justice and racial equity, it's very hyper analyzed and criticized in many respects. So our peer reviewers are also from the global majority and are really experienced academics and also global development practitioners. And so everything that you see in terms of our reports and what we are producing is heavily peer reviewed for multiple reasons. We have been on a journey since July of 2020, when everything kind of was cracked open within the global development sector. We started by launching a global mapping survey, specifically targeting, again, people within the sector. We want to hold organizations accountable, but ultimately organizations are made up of the people that work within them. So our target audience for this index is the people who work in global development, and specifically the people who are impacted by racial violence within global development organizations and by lack of inclusion and by lack of diversity in global development organizations. So all of what you see in terms of what we are building and launching next year is informed by the research that was gathered within the global mapping survey. We translated the survey in 10 languages. We received responses from over 80 countries, and we were able to mine the data to build what we call our index. I'm just going to go through a little bit in terms of our indicators and then what we're trying to do here. So we have created, based on this research for the global mapping survey, everything's on our website as well in terms of the results from that and the qualitative and quantitative data. We've developed 11 indicators to measure racial inequity within organizations. And we're talking about funders, development practitioners, consultancies, whoever works within the global development sector at large. And these indicators allow us to explore racial inequity broadly across an organization. These indicators include workplace culture, mission, salary, fund allocations, grant-making principles, leadership. So a lot of different areas where we see racial inequity popping up. And that can be layered, or it can be, broadly located within each of those indicators. Each of these indicators has significant work around it in terms of the definitions and how we talk about racial inequity within each indicator. So we have 11 indicators of racial equity. We're probably going to add another one or a couple more as we continue to do our research. But within each indicator, what we have also done is create subcodes that allow us to not only now look at racial equity broadly, but also now with depth within each of the indicators. So for example, when we talk about a workplace culture that has an environment where racial equity is thriving, that means that there is less racial abuse, less prioritization of white voices, less gaslighting and tokenism. And so we're able to really create subcodes, or we have created subcodes specific to each indicator that allow us to really kind of tease out the environment that either houses racial inequity or promotes racial equity within an organization. The last thing that I'll say is that a lot of the work that we've been doing is very much behind the scenes because the sector isn't ready to have this level of transparency around racial equity fully out there, right? And so we have a learning partnership with the Better Org. And within that learning partnership, we've been able to work with organizations to use the Racial Equity Index as part of their measurement tool in terms of assessing where they are on racial equity measures. The final thing that I will say is a lot of some interesting feedback that we receive when we talk about racial equity and specifically focusing on racial equity is, well, what about the other forms of oppression? And what I find really interesting about that is that because we're focusing on racial equity, we immediately are also focusing on the most layered forms of oppression that we find within organizations. So we are extremely intersectional in our approach because we recognize that when we're talking, for example, about disability rights, we know that those that identify as Black and disabled face the highest levels of oppression and marginalization. So just because we are called the Racial Equity Index doesn't mean we're not weaving in intersecting forms of oppression in our approach. I will pause there.
Okay, can we have an applause for both of the speakers? Thank you. I'm very curious because after hearing your presentation, I also understood that you have been in contact before. What are some of the similarities, but also some of the differences that you see between the two indexes? Perhaps Arisha, you would like to start.
I mean, I think in terms of similarities, we're both very much focused on accountability and sort of ensuring that within the sector. And I think that's something we've talked about is, if you look in the private sector, for instance, there are multiple indexes measuring DEI. And so we're thinking, why is our sector should be subject to the same level of scrutiny. So we think it's a good thing to have multiple indexes kind of focusing on equity. And the more initiatives we have within the ecosystem, I think the better. Yeah.
Yeah. How's that for you, Uma?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, when we say this within the Racial Equity Index for a sector that loves data, there certainly is very limited data in a very transparent way around racial equity or equity in general within global development organizations. And so, as Arisha said, the more light that we can shine on what is actually happening behind closed doors within organizations, the greater room we give to having very open discussions around racial equity and equity in general, but then also the challenges that organizations face in committing to and also moving through the journey that DEI inclusion efforts and racial equity requires.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's really inspiring to see that. I think and these initiatives, they also come from people that, as you explained, they come from people that are from, for example, in the case of Racial Equity Index, all people from BIPOC backgrounds, and they take this initiative forward and to actually bring it more, make it more accessible, but also open and possible to have these conversations. What I was wondering in creating these processes, and you already alluded a little bit about how, for example, these 11 indicators were developed, but also the pilot that Arisha mentioned in the Equity Index. What has been the process of developing such an index? Who do you invite? What steps do you take? Because it seems like a huge project.
Yeah, I can go first on that. So in terms of, for the pilot itself, I think it was a shared effort with the advisory council. I think it was culminated with a group of individuals who are also experts within this area, and they kind of fed into the development of the index too. But that is something that we acknowledged that we weren't able to integrate enough, I think, global South voices within the pilot index. And that's something we definitely want to be able to incorporate in the actual full index when we are able to sort of do that with the post fundraising. So in terms of considerations, I think I can jump into indicators now if that's helpful. Just to touch on that. So when we were developing the pilot index to try and kind of make sure that we were taking a proper intersectional approach, I think we had horizontal indicators and vertical indicators that we included in the pilot, and we intend to keep that for the actual index as well, the full one. So horizontal indicators sort of represented baseline equity standards applicable to all organizations, and then vertical indicators were more specific. So they sort of captured different types of organizations in the sector. That might include ODA spending government departments, nonprofit organizations, private sectors, et cetera. So they'll sort of be tailored more towards that. Yeah. And so that's something we kind of considered in the consideration of developing the pilot and the full index as well. And overall, we had some principles as well that kind of guided the development of that framework. And that was intersectionality, capturing a combination of policy and practice, having more qualitative than quantitative sort of in nature of the information, because we feel like equity is quite a difficult thing to capture quantitatively a lot of the time. So we felt like qualitative information might be helpful in that, being realistic, but also ambitious. Presenting a reasonable reporting burden for organizations as well, and considering that, and trying to avoid a tick box approach to equity, and sort of identifying entry points that can lead to meaningful change by sort of kickstarting a process. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. And for you, Uma.
Yeah, in our process of trying to really build the racial equity index, and we are very much in a build stage, because we will be releasing the first public version of the index next year, early next year, hopefully. It has very much been people-centered. So what I mean by that is that, you know, we have been doing a lot of work and intentional work around discussions around the data and how we analyze it, intentional work of how our own personal experiences are impacting how we see the data. You know, it's been an interesting experience for us, because again, because we have all experienced racism in global development, including our peer reviewers, and because our target audience is the people who work within global development, one of the things that we've had to really ingest and also hold is the weight that this work holds. We are building an index to hold global development organizations accountable for the harm that they cause to BIPOC communities. That's not an easy task. And what goes unnoticed more often than we talk about is that we talk about the benefits of DEI work, but we don't talk about the fact that that in the process of operationalizing DEI, people are still being impacted by inequitable practices. And so for us, the build of this index is very much rooted within how these experiences manifest, and also the psychological impact of it. We can't ignore it. We've had to take many days off in doing this work, just because some of the research that we've done has been really heavy, and it's been very hard to hold. And I want to encourage organizations to really think about the fact that there are people at the end of this work that you're doing, right? And so while we're trying to build the index to really build more accountability, we're doing so because this level of harm can't continue as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks for, I think, highlighting these different principles that are part of doing this work. So it's not just creating a set of indicators, it's really based on an entire process of understanding the values of how you would like to work. And I heard that intersectionality is something that is coming back strongly. At the same time, I really like the policy to practice approach that you mentioned as well, the qualitative and quantitative element. And it's, I think, also a very clear call to us as DEI practitioners that even though we're aiming to create more equitable spaces, in that process, if you're not aware of the forms of exclusion or oppression that you might perpetuate in your practices, that can also still be harmful. So I think it's really interesting to hear these perspectives. I had one small question, and then I also want to open it up to the other participants, and that is really about how organizations have received and worked with these different indexes. What has been the responses from organizations you've worked with? Are they open? Yeah. Perhaps for you, Uma, first.
Yeah, I will say that the organizations that we've worked with, we can't name, this is through our learning partnership with TBO, the Better Org, because they're a consultancy and we are all volunteers at the Racial Equity Index. And so for organizations that have worked with the Racial Equity Index, they have done so through the Better Org, and the Better Org has a license to use that the tool that we've developed and we are developing. And you know, I think what's interesting about organizations that have utilized the index and have taken, you know, the index, one is highlighting of areas where they didn't think about racial equity or inequity existing. So what I mean by that is we have 11 indicators. A lot of times organizations aren't thinking about where the pockets of racial inequity could be hiding within their organizations. And so it's been interesting for us to really see how the indicators allow folks within organizations to really think about how each of these practices are not only playing out within each section, but then throughout the organization. I think the second piece of this is for us, you know, again, this is a learning partnership. It's an engagement that we do with organizations, really understanding how we can, because again, our target audience is the people that work within the organizations, not the HR departments, not the DEI leads, but the people. And so what are the questions that we need to be thinking about either adding to our index or indicators that we need to add to our index to make sure that we're truly being intersectional in our approach, you know, and so this is why I mentioned we may be adding 1 or 2 more indicators just based on the work we've done with organizations. And I think the third thing that's been really interesting to see is how the index is applicable to both very, you know, smaller organizations, so 50 people or less, and then larger organizations as well. And how we're able to parse out some of the data, you know, so that we can do an analysis that really speaks to what is happening within an organization. So it's been a really interesting experience for us, but definitely it is a journey.
Yeah. I agree with Uma. I think we've seen some similar stuff as well in terms of engaging with organizations. So a lot of our engagement, I think, was more within the pilot phase, because what we did was we used publicly available data and we sort of put it into a table and we sort of said, here's what organizations do on a list of indicators. It was much more smaller in scale for that one, just because we were trying it out and we wanted to see how the indicators worked. And so what we did was once we gathered the publicly available information and put it into that table, we went back to organizations and said, hey, this is what we found. Can you just wanted to double check if it's correct? And if there was anything you wanted to add to it as well, let us know, or anything you wanted to update. So I think from in those conversations that were differing responses, I think some organizations were much more enthusiastic about it. Some were a little bit nervous about what this would look like for them if they were included in the table. And so there was some nervousness there. There was some curiosity, I think, on certain indicators. For instance, some organizations, you know, they had questions about why this indicator, could you expand on why that would be, why you're measuring that, for instance. So I think it was an interesting learning process in that respect. But what was interesting was we tried to also hold space within that table. You know, we had a list of indicators and sometimes it wasn't a hard yes or no on certain indicators. Some organizations might be doing work on that, but it wasn't obvious whether that would neatly fall into the indicators. So we tried to just include that extra context as well. And we allowed them to provide extra relevant information on certain indicators so that they could, yeah, it's one of those things that's it's a little bit difficult sometimes to completely neatly sort of fit into certain dimensions, sometimes equity. And so we allowed them the space to do that too, which I think they appreciated as well. So what was also quite interesting that came out of the pilot is we did a mix of consultancy sizes and sort of there are different types of consultancies who like McKinsey or KPMG that they specialize in one area and they have a development branch. And then we had some organizations that were pure development organizations as well. And we found the more corporate consultancies performed better overall in the indicators, at least compared to pure development. And that's probably just because they're subject to more scrutiny based on the sector that they're based in. But again, it kind of just reinforced the point of if they're being subject to that scrutiny, why can't we as a sector also do that? So that was also an interesting learning as well from it.
To the questions for the audience, I saw that Carol, you raised your hand. Are you able to?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very interesting. And as I work with INGOs on D&I processes, these kind of indexes are really helpful. What I come across though is that a lot of these inequities are sort of buried deep down in the HR practices of this organization, and the fact that especially those that have kind of grown over time and they've opened programs in different countries. And so to actually look at sort of salaries, benefits, contracts, status of all employers across multiple countries, across multiple labor laws, it becomes an enormous task. And with HR functions often underfunded, understaffed, and not necessarily also attracting the most competent or up-to-date individuals in the sector. So I was just wondering how, I mean, it's just such an enormous investment to even map what are the, I mean, it's crazy. They don't even know how they even pay their own employees, and comparing conditions is a huge job. Have you found sort of tools or methodologies, or when you have a big mess that is a result of years of colonial attitudes and unconscious sort of reactive practices, what can be helpful in trying to sort it out, knowing that also contracts are not easy to change?
Okay, that's a big question. Umay, would you like to take that on?
Sure. Carol, that is a very big question. There's a lot tied up in this question. And so I'm going to start from where I think every organization needs to start from. In any discussion around racial equity and racial justice, and really like resolving or trying to get to the root of where systemic inequities are presenting within an organization, I think just one of the things that needs to be named is the urgency culture and the white supremacy culture within the sector, and how this work is trying to be done in the raging river of program work and every other work that an organization is committing to. So when I hear an organization say, we don't have funds for HR, funds to do this work, well, do you have funds for something else? Can you redirect those funds? What are your priorities? What is your actual priority in rooting out inequity? And how much are you willing to dedicate time and resources to it? So that would be my first question, because this work can't happen, on top of everything else. There has to be room made for it. So there can be breath injected into it. There could be room to engage with it, because it's going to unsurface a lot of stuff, right? It's like the 400 years of colonial history and pain and everything that the global development sector sits on. That's not going to be upended by one external consultant coming in and doing a mapping of HR practices. It's going to take dedicated time and resources and years. And so that would be the very first thing that I would say. There's a lot of other thoughts I have.
Yeah, but I mean, we actually offer dedicated time and resources to do this work. And even with that, it's just, and it's organization who ask for the support, but it's just the mere volume of it is, and it's a question of priorities. Yeah.
I want to give space for Arisha to reply as well, but I also want to know if there are any other questions in the room.
Yeah, I can jump in as well. I definitely agree with everything Uma said. I think that's like exactly spot on. And I think with that as well, I think something we have found, I mean, part of like what we're trying to do with the index is almost to put a little bit of pressure and say, here's what we found, even based on stuff like pay gap reporting, ethnicity reporting, and then, you're putting organizations next to their peers, and the idea being that they can see what others are doing too, and hopefully that could push for some kind of meaningful change. But I think it's also exploring other avenues of pressure or to push for this. And one, for instance, would be, here we have the International Development Committee, they had an inquiry on racism in the aid sector, which we provided evidence for. And through that, I think a report came out and we kind of emphasized the need for transparency, again, publishing your data, prioritizing this work. And so I think if the government potentially can take this seriously too, then that's also another avenue. It's just kind of helping to shift the mindsets of different actors within the ecosystem, and hopefully that can kind of have a knock-on effect on how organizations operate as well. For instance, if there are more requirements or there's a push on that side as well, for that. Yeah.
We also have 3 minutes left, so and I know that Uma needs to leave in time. I wanted to then perhaps end with a final question, and if people still have the time to tag along after that, that's fine. But I just wanted to ask Uma and Arisha, 5 years ahead in time, what would you ideally have achieved? What are your long-term perspectives on what you would like to get achieved in the coming years?
I think for the Racial Equity Index, we want to be able to have a public searchable database of organizations that have taken annual assessments with us, so that we can track changes over time and organizations' commitments to racial equity, so that there's a measure of accountability. And the people that are holding these organizations accountable are not funders, but the people that work in this sector. I would love to see, along with that, we will also be doing a pulse check for the sector at large, which is what we're releasing next year, in terms of where the sector stands just generally on racial equity. And so continuing that and just seeing the change over time, because I think folks think that things are changing, but they definitely are not, unfortunately. There's a lot of stagnation. We've seen a lot of reduction in commitments to DEI initiatives and racial equity initiatives. We've seen a loss of funding and funders pulling their racial equity programs, which is devastating. So for us, it's more about pushing for transparency and accountability, and hopefully increasing in that, and then ensuring and hopefully creating a space where people who work in global development who are impacted by racial inequity feel like their stories are seen and heard and upheld and held by us at the Racial Equity Index.
I think for the equity index, in terms of about 5 years from now, we're just hoping, for us to secure the funding that we need and have a fully equitable recruitment process and team in place, ideally with individuals from the Global South. And once that is achieved, run the index with each segment in the UK development sector. And we aspire to just really be part of the landscape, working with organizations and networks who are also engaging in this work. And we see ourselves as a 1% solution here. And I think it's only by working with other organizations and individuals in the UK to really just contribute to increasing transparency in the sector, and hopefully push for meaningful change as a result of that.
Great. I think that's a very clear call to all of us, to ensure that, in order for you to keep your work moving on, we also need to be attentive and show interest. And I think that's really necessary. I wanted to end the Q&A, and thank you both for participating today. I know you have to run. Thank you so much. We will make sure that the information and contact details of both the Racial Equity Index and the Equity Index is available, and that you can send your follow-up questions. So know that you should reach out to them. And I do believe that they deserve a spot in the international development sphere, if we would like to call that anyway, international development, but they should really claim a spot and push for more accountability and work on equity in international development. So thank you so much. Thank everybody for listening in, and I'm wishing you a very pleasant rest of your day. Bye-bye.